We know that life will let us down at some point, and the people we love the most will inevitably let us down at some point too. We're all only human, and life can't really go exactly the way we plan. But we do have a choice in how we respond when hard and hurtful things happen. We can either get bitter or we get better. And today we're going to talk about healing from hurts and growing from them. So, Dr. Kim, is there an example of anyone who you have known who either grew bitter or grew better?
Yes. I mean, I can think of a couple of people over my life, and certainly some people in counseling or family members of people in counseling that I've heard about. But it seems like when someone gets a negative thing in their mind and they don't deal with it, don't say, hey, I got to deal with this, I need to get better, then that grid, they pass everything through that kind of grid of bitterness, and the bitterness continues to grow. And the person that I know, a person I know well that has done that and continue to do that, and it's like has done this for probably 10 or 12 years in a relationship, and the relationship gets more distant and distant and distant, and the person gets more bitter toward the other person when the other person really hadn't done much. It maybe not in their perspective. Instead of coming to someone when you're upset with them and saying, hey, this is what I'm upset about, can we talk about it? You just make an assumption and you're bitter, and then you continue to take every piece of information you get, and it just kind of stacks up, and then the bitterness grows and grows and grows, and that is so unhealthy for someone. I mean, bitterness can lead to death eventually. Serious, people just literally get sick from their bitterness.
Oh man, that's a bleak picture. I've seen it happen too, and it's like it's isolating. The person ends up alone because everyone who's made them mad, they can't handle being around or interacting with, and it's devastating to see it. But for me, the inspiration for this topic was my granddad. So he's a person who got better. So it's a little more fun to talk about that. But he went to heaven just about 18 months ago at the age of like 91, and he was a pastor. He was a Christian counselor, and every year he would say, I'm still asking God for 5 more years because I just love my life. He didn't want to go, even though he was excited to go be in heaven eventually. He just was never ready. But that's not because his life was easy. He had a really hard time with losing his grandma and my uncles, all 3 of them, my grandma, and then, my granddad's 2 sons, my uncles, all suffered from terrible illnesses that just eventually, like they suffered and then passed away. So there was Alzheimer's and ALS, and they just got sicker and sicker. But he did say that in spite of that, all that loss, he said, we have a choice to either get bitter or better. And so he was full of joy. He was always encouraging. He always looked for how to find the good in people and to bring like life and liveliness and joy into situations, and never heard him complain ever. And that is something that's a rare quality. So we've tried to learn and follow in that example.
It's so much how we look at things in our perspective. And it sounds like his perspective was always looking for the good, even in the bad. And I love that. And I think it's something that I think most of us want to be able to do that, because sometimes we feel justified in our anger and all that kind of stuff. In the big picture, it never really does us any good at all. Yeah. It just doesn't. And a lot of times we're the one suffering. The other person isn't suffering at all because they don't, they're not dealing with it in the same way, or they're not even aware of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm interested to unpack this topic a little bit because, hearing him say that example of the choice to get bitter or better, he actually said that at my uncle's funeral, speaking at his son's funeral. And it was like, oh, like if you could say that at that point, like that's a serious challenge to all of us, because would I be able to say that that's what I've chosen? Does my life have the fruit to show that? And so it kind of puts it in perspective, like it's not what's done to you, it's how you respond that will really determine where you're going. So that's kind of what I'm interested in unpacking today for each of us, so we can look at ourselves and kind of assess how we can be on that growing track. Yeah, because I think we've probably all seen people who got bitter. We've probably all seen it. Somebody was jaded or cynical or angry, and they would just repeat the same mistakes over and over, and
Mm-hmm.
things would just be really hard, and relationships continue to crumble, and they're alone, and they're saying mean things at waitresses and the checkout counter at
Yeah.
Lowe's. It's just it's coming out everywhere. They never seem to learn from it. So how do we avoid becoming that person? Like, how can we tell if you're growing or if you're stuck?
Yeah, I think we have to. I think self-awareness is a huge part of it. And we do that by just being honest with ourselves and prayer. I think to just, okay, God, the prayer of search my heart and know me, test me and know my anxious thoughts, see if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting is a scary prayer to pray. But it's one of those prayers that you open the door for God to come in and show you areas that you could be better in, or maybe you are getting better in, or something that we're so easy to rationalize things, yeah, I'm upset, but do you know what they did to me? Or,
Yeah.
one of my stories my pastor has told about a guy that was in their church, I believe, that had molested, or maybe it was a school teacher, his sister for a number of years until they found out, and how that affected them. And then how at one point his family wrote him a letter giving him forgiveness, and the freedom that gave them when they were able to let go of that. And so to me, that's one of the extreme things that you think of. Someone abuses a child like that, how, if someone abuses your child, how in the world do you not get consumed with that, and how you forgive? Because I think that's what God tells us he wants us to do. And then I think he will also help us do that. And for some people, I think it's a process. I think it was with them. We know we need to forgive, but we're just not quite there yet. So, so I think self-awareness, asking God, being honest with yourself. Are you angry? Why are you angry? If I'm, or if Nancy says, you seem angry, my answer doesn't need to be, no, I'm not. My answer needs to be, what are you seeing? Or, okay, am I angry? It's something I am, but I'm not really aware of it or conscious of it, because I'm not yelling and screaming and throwing things, but there's an anger there. And I think sometimes we continue in patterns. We do the same things over, and they're not working, but we continue to do them. Are you doing that? And is that causing you frustration and anger? I think asking somebody else that knows you well enough and loves you enough to be honest with you. And that could be, that's where I think for guys, having an accountability partner that's willing to do that and get in your face and say, hey, I see some things in you that I think you're angry, or I think you're being bitter. Every time you talk about so-and-so, your whole countenance changes. And someone that will do that. Because I think and then asking God to reveal those things, I think we, in our relationships and in our lives, we move forward or backwards. And I think you've got to be aware, am I moving forward? If I'm moving backwards, I'm probably getting into bitterness. And if I'm moving forward, then I'm getting better and getting healing. And so I think a lot of it is just being honest with yourself and letting God come in and do his work within you.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And that's, it's not always easy to know. It takes a little time to sort through that. Like that prayer you're saying, it might take a few kind of layers to get down to what's underneath it. I know sometimes when I've had a hard time knowing if I'm ready to forgive, for much smaller things than the example you gave, but I would kind of have, I'm not ready to forgive, but my chest feels really tight. For me, it feels like tightness in my chest. It feels like a lump in my stomach. It feels like just unsettled. And like I have this tense energy to me that I feel like I'm kind of humming even when I'm sitting still. It's just this discomfort that I can tell, like if I take it to the Lord and kind of sit with it long enough, for a few minutes, he kind of brings it to the surface to say, yeah, that is that unforgiveness. You're feeling uncomfortable because you're not letting it go. But if I didn't really think about it, it would be easier to just distract myself, find a distraction, try to move on.
No, I agree. And I think, another way that you talked about, I think prayer, I think journaling helps a lot because it helps me clarify things. I believe when you journal, pencil and paper is the best way to do it. I mean, you can journal online, and that's great for some things. But if you're really trying to process, I just think the way we're wired, that pen and paper, pencil and paper helps a lot, and it gives me clarity to do that. And just trusting God, that prayer of that I gave. I don't think it's a one-time prayer. I think it's almost a daily prayer, and because I think you're being aware there that there could be some things by saying it daily, and you're giving God permission to come in to your life and help you with that, or reveal things to you. And it's a scary prayer because he's going to do it. And I think you have to be ready, but in the big picture, knowing he's not going to do anything that's not good for you and for the relationship and for your marriage or whatever it is that you're struggling with.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. I agree. It's a scary prayer. I think it's very true.
Yeah.
But because he does answer. I mean, that's why it's scary, because he's faithful. He comes through and he'll show you. He'll point out exactly what's in there that's not okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then it's like, well, okay, I did ask for that, so
Exactly.
so I'll receive it.
Yeah, and you can't take it back. It's like
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's one of the important pieces is like this. The growth it's not like black and white. It's like a process.
Absolutely.
And
I think sometimes we think, oh, we're supposed to forgive, and we're just right now. I think it's a process. I think for me, in a couple of situations, it was God help me to forgive, help me to get to the point where I'm willing to forgive. And I think God understands that. I think he just wants your heart. And if your heart is to forgive, you're heading that direction. That's what he wants. It's when we say, no, they do not deserve forgiveness. I'm never going to forgive them. That's where our heart gets hardened. And I think that's where we can block God out and not let him work in our lives.
Yeah, totally. Well, and then even after making the decision, it's like making the decision. Like, hey, I've forgiven, and Lord, help me to remember that I made that decision and I want to stay there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So do you think it's just as simple as just deciding to grow? I mean, we've given some steps, but is it like, we're saying it's not black and white. So if you want to decide to be better and not bitter, how do we do that?
Well, I think, 12-step teaches some things, other things. I think you've got to admit you have a problem. I think that's the first thing in acknowledging, because you don't ever admit that there is a problem or there's something here I need to deal with, then you're not going to deal with it. You're just going to continue to ignore it. So, and how do you know that? Well, if everyone around you is telling you have a problem, including your spouse, you probably have a problem, And so I think you do listen to the people that you respect in your life. If your marriage is a good marriage and you communicate well, and your spouse is saying, I think you got a problem with this anger towards so-and-so. I see it every time we're around them. You just change completely. That you value that in your spouse, to listen to that. And so that's one thing. Steps, I think, how deep is it? Is it something that you have tried to just forgive and let go of, and it's just not going? And so counseling can be certainly a good option there, of having someone help you walk through that, maybe get a little deeper to where the roots of it. Maybe it is this person that's presenting a problem. Maybe the roots go back to your childhood. And so having someone that's help you do that, so you really don't just keep replacing, okay, forgive this person, but then I'll replace it with somebody else because I haven't dealt back with the root cause of it. I think repentance of just saying, this is not what God's best is for me. This is not what he has for me. That this type of anger is not, I know we talk about righteous anger sometime. I'm not sure that any of us have righteous anger other than God. I think we try to say things are, but God says a lot about be angry and do not sin. So he knows we're going to get angry. I think we have a tendency to get angry and sin. We have a tendency to get mad at someone, or to hurt someone, or say something, or treat someone bad when we're angry, and that doesn't honor God. So I think we have to be aware of those kind of things. Prayer, and I think some accountability. Once you get to that point, I need someone that's going to love me enough to get in my face and say, how are you doing that this week? You were going to pray about it every day, and you were going to journal about it, or you were going to reach out to this person with a nice text. Have you done that? Some accountability, I think, really helps. So yes, I think you've got to decide, but then it's not just deciding, it's really getting deep within yourself and admitting there is a problem here and there is something that needs to change.
That's really good. And I love that you started with that step of humility, of admitting there's a problem. I think that there was a point not too long ago where I was just struggling with some stuff that I felt like, I feel like people in my life were letting me down, and repeatedly in the same ways. And then I started to be like, wait, okay, if everyone is bugging me all the time, maybe it's me. And so I had to kind of go, what's really going on here? Do I need to make some changes? And it was kind of like that moment of just kind of finally getting humble enough to say, okay, maybe I have to stop pointing at everyone else and start looking at myself, because that's the only person I can change anyway. And that was like probably the most helpful thing, because what I started to realize was a lot of times things that bothered me, I wasn't honest about. I wasn't, telling the truth to myself or to someone else. And I wasn't saying, oh, I'm hurt by this situation. Oh, I feel disrespected by that, or just naming different things that I wasn't letting myself see. And so therefore I wasn't able to like work through well with relationships, because I couldn't deal with it with myself. Yeah. And so that starting with the honest starting place of, okay, I have a problem, instead of everyone around me has a problem, that was actually a place where things could start changing. So that's a very important step.
Yeah, I think it's really good. It's just a lot of times it's really hard for us to point the finger back at ourselves. Mm-hmm. But I love what you said, because I've been there before too. It's like, what is wrong with all these people? Mm-hmm. And then it's like, maybe nothing. maybe it's me. And so I think sometimes it's hard for us to get there, but that's a first step of figure it out, like you did, of begin the healing process there.
Yes. And that was, that was a couple years ago, and it's been really eye-opening to see how much, it was me. I had to change things, and I can't change somebody else.
Right. And I think important. We talk about that off and on in podcasts, but it's so important to realize what you just said there. We can't change anybody else. Mm-hmm. But you can change yourself. So even in a situation, I think sometimes where I feel like the other person maybe really is the problem. Okay, but maybe my problem is I'm not responding to that person the right way. And so what can I do if I'm, if that person irritates me, and so, I'm probably not as nice to that person. And so, okay, how do I deal with it? Well, I'm going to be kind to that person, or I'm going to reach out to that person. And so you take that approach and just get angry and say, well, they just bug me all the time. I hate being around them. Take a step forward and try to put the bridge out there to cross.
Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe at other times, maybe you put a boundary in place. Absolutely. Where you say, hey, we can be around you, but you don't get to make the plans all the time, or you don't get to tell me what I'm doing that day. Put some kind of boundary in place to say, I'd like to hang out with you, but we need to be on equal footing, some kind of way to not have to be at the mercy of the person, and give some honesty there.
I think that's really good. The boundary can really help. Okay, can we redefine this relationship where it's healthy for both of us, healthier for you, but definitely healthy for both of you. And sometimes a boundary and just communicating about it will help too.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. Well, so one thing I'm thinking as we're talking about interpersonal kind of hurts, but what about for the things where it's not a person that's hurt you, but a situation? Say it's a loss, or, some kind of painful situation that's happened. What if your issue is not with another person?
What if it's God? I was talking to somebody about this, and I think it's so true of us. When something bad happens in our life, we don't usually blame the enemy. We blame God. And so I think, you lose a loved one that you prayed for diligently for God to heal, and the person died. And so you're bitter. Why didn't God answer my prayer? And so I think in that it's one, grieving that person and grieving that loss, and then also learning more about God, that there are things we don't understand, and that did God heal that person in heaven as opposed to healing them on earth? And I think what was best for that person. Oh my gosh, this person suffered horribly for 2 years. And I was asking God, yes, to heal them, but not to take them. And so I think we have to, it gives us a chance to grow in a different way, and in our relation, and learning more about God, and learning to trust the fact that he is good, and that he always does good for us. And that's hard sometimes. it's easier to get angry and bitter at God. But where does that get us? Where does that get me when I want God and need him? And I haven't really nurtured that relationship with him, and I separated myself from him. So I think the bitterness can be at God. It can, and I think that as Christians, and a lot of times we do that. And I think non-Christians do, that's why I don't believe in your God. Look, why didn't he do this? Why does he let people suffer? Why did they lose their child? Those kind of things. And a lot of things we don't have answers for, but I think if we dig into it with God, he will take us from bitterness to maybe not complete understanding, but he will heal that. Does that make sense? I mean,
I think so. And I think too, it's interesting as you're talking, it's reminded me it's the same kind of concept of like all the questions of why would he this and why does he allow that are still finger pointing. It's not the honesty of like, I'm just really hurt. And that is a lot more productive place to start.
Yes.
Like you were saying, like the grief process is a process, but it should progress. Like you shouldn't just stay stuck in, one stage. There should be some progression. And I think part of that is we have to at some point stop pointing fingers or stop saying, why God, why? Because he might not tell you.
Yeah.
And you don't get to understand everything that he has decided to do.
Absolutely. And so I think you want to get through those stages of grief to the point of this, I still don't like it, but I accept this is what happened. I'm ready to move forward. And I think too, Jesus told us that we'd have trouble in this world. He never, and I think sometimes we go into Christianity think, wow, we got it made. We're going to have heaven on earth. And yes, there's great things about being a Christian in this life. It gives us a different perspective. It gives us a joy that I think we don't have otherwise, but we're not in heaven yet. And so bad thing. But what he does promise is he'll always there. He's there to walk through it with you. He's with those people at a funeral or in a nursing home or wherever we are, that God is there to help us and walk through things with us. And that's really good. I mean, that keeps us from being alone in those situations. And so I've learned that, I might get angry, but I've got to get to where I make sure I'm putting God back where he needs to be and seeing him as who he is and not putting labels on him that he doesn't deserve.
Yeah, that's good.
That are negative.
Yeah, that's a really healthy place to get to eventually.
Yeah, and and we can talk about it. I probably said that in 3 or 4 minutes. It's not going to happen in 3 or 4 minutes.
Right.
But I think just having that mindset of God is good and I'm going to figure out where he's good in this.
Yeah.
Whatever it takes. With his help, maybe help with some others, maybe a counselor, whatever, that I'm gonna get there.
Yeah. Well, and that reminds me, you did a great podcast interview with Stacy Henagan a couple years ago about trusting God in grief.
Yeah.
And she talked really through that process that they went through. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes because it goes a lot deeper on really going through that grief process, which I think she was just really encouraging.
Yeah, that's great. That's right.
Yeah. Well, okay. So what is the difference between ignoring or stuffing our hurt and healing from it? Because I know sometimes the temptation is to just go, you know what? I'm going to buckle up. I'm going to pull myself up from my bootstraps. I'm going to get better and just move forward, forge ahead without dealing. So what's the difference? How do we make sure we're not just ignoring it, but actually dealing?
Because I don't think that works. I mean, you may think it works short term, but I don't think it works in the long term. Because you haven't dealt with it. And we're just not wired that way. We can't just compartmentalize everything inside of us or let things stack up and just act like they're not there. And so I think what usually happens, it does turn into anger or bitterness, or it's just something's going to happen that's different because you haven't dealt with it. And I know some things are hard to deal with. And sometimes we think, I'm just going to act like that didn't happen. Well, it did happen. And there are things that I think can happen that we just decide to choose to let go of, choose to give it to God. And I think that is a way of dealing with it. But when we ignore it or stuff it down, then we're not dealing with it. And it's going to come back and hurt us. And so the healing comes from dealing with it, admitting, did you have a part in that? Forgiveness. And that you have a plan for moving forward. So there's a big difference there. And it takes more work. It takes more effort, but the other side is completely different than ignoring it. Ignoring it, it's you're not getting rid of it. And you're probably going to have something else happen to you stack on top of that. And at some point, you're just going to go,
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just all over the place, or it comes out sideways, or you end up hurting someone you don't want to hurt, or those kind of things. So I get that it's hard, but it's also absolutely worth it. And once you work through something like that, and you begin to do that consistently, because you're going your whole life, you're going to have people that irritate you, or things that happen that you don't understand.
No, say it ain't so.
And so, but I think the more we get used to going to God and let Him work through that, that becomes just a natural pattern, as opposed to getting caught up in our anger and our bitterness. And, I know. We don't. If we could live in a bubble, but and
so funny.
You're a pastor's wife. The church is not a safe place. In a lot of ways. I mean, you're not going to go to church and not find somebody. There's going to be somebody irritate you or says something. And so you're going to have to deal with it wherever you are.
And if there's not somebody who irritates you, you probably just don't know people there very well.
Or it's
like
you,
people, or it's you.
It's you. If you're the person, if all your family, every family has some family member that, they dread being around, or what am I going to do this Christmas? And if you're not in that conversation, it's probably you that they're talking about. So.
Oh, no. Well, to be honest, that's why we're having this conversation, right? So we can make sure that we're not becoming that person.
Exactly.
It is so funny. I remember when I was much younger, the first time I realized there was just that one person in my life who was just driving me up a wall. And I remember thinking, once I am in a situation where I'm not dealing with this person, things are going to be so much easier. And then somebody said something like, well, there's always somebody difficult in your life. And I went, oh, man. And because I realized it was true. There's always somebody, because you could change context. There's still humans everywhere.
Years ago, I was on a board, and there was a guy on that I could not stand. He irritated me every board meeting. I was hoping he wouldn't be there because I was chair of that board. And so we were, one day after the meeting, God said, I want you to start praying for him. And I thought, this isn't you, God. This is somebody else told me to do this. But I did. And it was amazing. I began to look at that guy different. God really did it all. But I opened myself up to help see him through God's eyes. And so I think if you got trouble, that really, I think, is a prayer that is, sometimes we don't want to pray, but I think God teaches us through that.
Yeah.
God, help me to see this person through your eyes. Because God loves that person as much as he loves you, that was always hard for me. I thought, no, he can't love that person as much as he loves me. Does God not know how irritating that person is?
That is so funny. I love that happened, though. What a great experience.
It was. It was just, it came from God. And I thought, well, darn.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to be justified in my anger, God.
Right.
And I want you to say you don't like him either.
Right. Oh, that's funny. That's a great challenge. I love that. I mean, I love that. Anytime you pray for somebody, you're gonna shift some things.
It does. It does. Whether it's your spouse or whoever it is. Yeah.
Yes. I know. And I'll tell my kids that too when they're irritating each other. I'm like, man, you guys are so lucky that you get to practice dealing with somebody who's driving you crazy, because your whole life
there's going to be somebody.
There's going to be somebody. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, that just had me remembering some situations that I did not enjoy in my life, but long gone. It was such a funny, vivid moment to realize there's always somebody there. So what if we are stuck dealing with somebody who does not want to get better? If we want to get better and they don't.
Yeah. And I think that's hard, because we still always want to, okay, I'm working on this and getting better. Why in the heck aren't you interested in getting better? So I think going back to what you said earlier, Lindsay, is so important. You can only control yourself. And I think prayer, asking God to help you understand, asking God, is there something I need to do I'm not doing? I think not enabling that person is important. And then I think if you need to set boundaries, like you mentioned earlier, that you set boundaries so that you are okay, so that you're safe, that you're healthy. And it's not your responsibility to change that person. You can give them an opportunity, but it's really God's job to change that person. It's that person's job to allow God to come in and change them. And, as a counselor, I don't change people. God changes them. I give them ideas, and I talk to them about things. but I can't change them. I can't have somebody come in and say, I'm angry about this, change me. No, that's something that they have to do, and they have to let God do within them. So I think we have to accept that, and because we want to control them. I look, I'm doing better on this, so let me tell you what I did, and you can do this. Well, they may not do that.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you're going to be more annoyed if they don't.
Yes, exactly.
I think one thing with that is, do you think, I'm just thinking of certain relationships where a lot of times a person who is more on the bitter side they like to share. People like to vent.
Yes.
And so I think one boundary would be to just to put a limit on that and say, I cannot take your calls if this just to tell me how mad you are this day.
That's right. Absolutely. Or to put a parameter around it. Okay, if you need to vent and I'm your person, how about 3 minutes and let's talk about something good or something like that. You're right. And that's, again, putting a boundary around it. What can you do to make it healthier for you? And ultimately, I hope it does make them stop and think a little bit. But that can't be the reason you do it, because then you'll be disappointed if they don't.
Right. Yeah, but it could help you to not have
to
put up with it so much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think we're all probably still dealing with some hurt and loss and grief and some degree of trauma from the past couple of years. And where I live, we had a major natural disaster just like 18 months before the pandemic. So it's just, we were already struggling before. So are you seeing this in the counseling room? Are people in general struggling a little bit?
Well, I think the pandemic brought out some things in all of us. It's something we never had experienced before. And we had to do things we never had to do. We had to wear masks. For a while early on, we had to quarantine and stay in. And I can still remember driving down the street and seeing all these places closed. And it was like Christmas Day is the only other time I see it like that. And it was just weird. Parking lots empty. So I think we had a lot we had to deal with. It was almost surreal at times in that.
Yeah.
And then if you're struggling in your marriage or something like at that time, or like you guys had where you'd had the hurricane and the trauma of that in your area, and that happened, 18 months is not very long when it came, and then you go into the pandemic. This spring, we had a community that's close to Oklahoma City that had a bad hurricane, a tornado, Seminole, Oklahoma. And so those people with everything else that was going on had that come on top of them too. And so I think just because of the things we've had to deal with COVID and with, I think, and then with the unrest that's happened in our country, with a lot of division, that there is more anger and there's more bitterness, and why can't things be the way they used to be? And there has been some loss and just grief of the loss of life was before the pandemic. And I think I've heard so many people over the last couple of years say, well, we got to get back to normal. I don't think that normal will never be again because we've experienced the pandemic. And so it's what's our new normal going to be when we get there, or will we? Is it always going to be something? I don't know, but I think as a Christian, you have to deal with it. Take time to grieve if that's what you need to do, and then trust God, because really, what other choice do we have?
Right.
I mean, we can just wallow in our bitterness and hurt and anger, or we can let God help us heal and help us deal with what we have to deal with day after day. And to me, that's really what the Christian life is all about. And how do we be a light in this darkness? And it starts with you. It starts with me of being that light, and then hopefully it's contagious to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of stuff that we just maybe have to let go of, let go of looking for these circumstances to come back the way we want them to be. Because as long as we're looking for that, it's just disappointing.
It is.
Yeah.
And embracing, God's always got something. God works good in everything. And sometimes it's hard to see it. I get that. Things we've talked about today that are hard to see that, but I think you keep looking for that. And I think eventually we do see it most of the time.
Yeah. But I don't think we can, as long as we're still fixated on what we've lost. Like, no. I think if you're looking for, like you said, like for the exact old normal to come back that's going to be really frustrating because you're not even present with what's happening now.
Yeah, and I think realizing that grief is not just when somebody dies. There's grief when life doesn't go the direction that we thought it was going to go. And certainly death is in that, but it could be a divorce. It could be illness. It could be anything, pandemic. Life, nobody saw that coming. Life was very different for us. And so that's a grief process. And if we don't grieve through that, we're going to have some consequences from it just because we didn't deal with it.
Yeah. So how do you think in general, like how can we kind of assess where we are? Like if we don't know if we need to grieve, like you just said, or we don't know if we're really in a healthy place or not, how can we practically get a good feel for where we are right now to move forward?
I, in January, Lindsay and I started playing pickleball, a little over a year ago now, but about 6 or 8 months. We were loving it. We're doing a lot of things with friends, and I thought I was really getting good. And so so on January 9th, I broke my wrist because I went for a shot I shouldn't, and I went down and not only broke it, but I had to have surgery. And so, I thought I was really handling things well, but I really wasn't. And I did slip into a depression. I think it happened. I ignored some warning signs. Nancy was my helper in that. And she said, you just seem like you're kind of down. And I realized that I wasn't, things I enjoyed doing, I was not doing. I think I grieved not being able to go play. Something that became a big part of my life for 3 months that I couldn't play. And so I think I began to look at I'm not enjoying things as much. There's things that I would really look forward to and enjoy, and I'm not. And so I think realizing, and a broken wrist didn't even compare with a death or anything like that. But I think things like that, it's an example of when life didn't go the way we thought it was going to go. And so I had to be aware of that. And I was kind of withdrawing from people. I remember when my dad died, which has been 22 years ago, I guess now. And my dad and I were just so close, and I looked up to him so much, and it was really hard. It was, I'd lost grandparents, and I'd lost, some other things, but not someone was that integral in my life, because we worked day to day together till I went into ministry for 13 years. And so we were very, very close. And I just remember, I thought I was doing pretty good. And then probably, 6 or 8 weeks after he died, it was like I got up that day and everything was like in color. And I realized I've been never seeing everything in black and white since he died. And so I think just knowing that when something happens to us, or that we're probably going to, if we're human at all, it's going to affect us. And I think it's taking time to see, how is it affecting us? Ask your spouse, ask other people, ask God, and then pray through it, and just be honest with yourself. We weren't created to deal with those things and just pop up the next day. We're not robots. We weren't just like we can be programmed and okay, yeah, well, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
As a quick aside, I had a guy I worked with. He was probably in his mid-30s when I met with him. But I think this is an example of way things people used to deal with. His mom died when he was 8 years old. He went to the funeral. Well, while they were at the funeral, people came in and they took his mother out of the house. Pictures, anything that was referenced to her was removed from the house. It was like, wow, she died. We had the funeral. Now we're not going to talk about her anymore. And they didn't. And he had never shared that to me. And the other thing he shared with me, that he had prayed every night for his mom to get well, except the night she died.
No.
And nobody was there to talk to him about it. It was like she never existed, so he could never talk with anybody about it. Wow. So just an example of, I think people didn't used to, in some cultures, and I'm not sure what church he grew up in or whatever, they didn't deal with things well like that. And so that was something that had framed him, been a part of his life for a long time, and he never told anybody that story until we went in counseling. And it was a huge change for him. It was then to be able to really grieve, and it was then that he knew how it affected him, and then how to move forward. And his wasn't really the bitterness; it was just this confusion and some anger in there too. Of I loved her. Why don't we ever talk about her?
Yeah,
It's kind of an extreme example, but I think it really illustrates kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, because I've heard it said, and I'm not sure if I'm quoting. I don't know who I'm quoting, so it's not really a quote. But I've heard that hurts that are buried alive.
Yeah.
The conflicts that are buried alive. So these things that we stuff away and don't deal with, it's not gone. It's just not dealt with, and it's waiting to.
And you never know when it might come out if you don't do it.
Yeah. Wow. That's it. That was a good example. And I think too. Just thinking about all of that, like I love that you shared the example about your wrist, because I think a lot of us do kind of what you did really well. It's not as bad as if loss of a life, or it's not as bad as, it could be a lot worse. And for me, that's a kind of an unhealthy kind of stuffing mechanism that I would use a lot. Like, oh, well, I have, this thing, but it's not as bad as somebody else's. And in that way, I'm not dealing with it because I'm just comparing it and trying to brush it off. But that's not helpful or healthy.
No.
Because even though it's a different hurt, it still is a hurt that needs to be dealt with.
Absolutely. You lose a finger. Well, I still got 9, but you did lose that one. And we know that sometimes you still have feeling where that finger was. And so you've got to grieve that.
Yeah.
And okay, what's my new normal going to be? And sometimes we do try to, I don't know. Sometimes Christians were probably the worst. Oh, that doesn't bother me.
Sure, yes.
God's taking care of it. Well, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
But God wired us a certain way to deal with things.
Yeah. And I've heard some truly like bothersome stories of just different types of Christian cultures really actively pushing this, like, everything's okay. You have to be happy. You have to stay happy. Rejoice always. This just sort of false positivity over everything that is not true, or that, people would come in when you're grieving a loved one and say, well, that all things happen for good for those who love it. And you're like, no, I mean, that
you want to punch them out.
It's true. Ultimately, it's not the time for that.
No.
And so that. Yeah. So that is a culture that many of us may have been exposed to if we've been in church, but that is not helpful for processing, and not, I don't think godly. I mean, look at the Psalms. The Psalms are full of grief, lament, and anger, everything.
Jesus wept when Lazarus died.
Yes.
I mean, we know Jesus had those emotions. They are okay.
Yeah.
He didn't act like everything was okay, and he knew he was going to heal him, but he still grieved.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's so
he was
true.
Empathetic with sisters and others that were grieving. So
yeah, he did not tell them to suck it up.
No.
No. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a great example. So what are some practical ways to really make the switch to go from stuck and cynical and bitter to healing and growing?
I think a lot of times counseling really does help with this. Just to dig in and do that. I think prayer is an important part of it. I think journaling is an important part of that. All those things where you can begin to process. And then I think some accountability. Hey, I am stuck with this. I need you to walk through this with me. So I think those are some good things. But don't hesitate to go to a counselor if you feel like, that God made Christian counselors, I believe, to help us walk our journeys through life. And if you feel like you need to go to a Christian counselor, talk to somebody that's been to one, get a recommendation, and go and see what God does in that situation. Just don't stay stuck there. That's the main thing. Do whatever it takes to go through this. And you may want to talk to your pastor. There may just find someone that you feel safe with and you feel like can help you and take that time. And if you're married, ask your spouse to be praying for it. Pray together with your spouse for this, because I think sometimes we don't involve our spouse in those situations. And that's kind of why you got married, for better or worse, rich or poor, sickness, health, all those kind of things. So live out the vows that you took. Involve your spouse in that and let them walk beside you. And one, I think it's an easier walk. Two, I think it'll grow your marriage.
Yes. Yeah. Getting through that together.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah.
That's good. And I think one other thing I would add to that list is, I think worshiping God through music and in the word, journaling through the Psalms, can help you get in touch with some of the things you've been dealing with. But I think just shifting our perspective sometimes really can be helpful. And I think worship is very powerful to do that.
I totally agree. Sitting down with maybe your Bible and a pencil or pen and paper and have worship music on and just asking God to guide you through that time can be powerful. He just will show up.
I think that's good. And I think sometimes if you are aware that there's some stuff you're dealing with and you haven't named it or worked through it, sitting down with a Bible and pencil, it's like the scariest thing you could do, because you have to be willing to think through this stuff and remember, hurtful things and process through them. So it is a little bit terrifying to sit alone and quiet, but I do think it's a great place to start.
Yeah, and you're doing it with someone that loves you more than you can even imagine. So don't lose sight of that. And it isn't easy, but I think, I don't know that I've ever worked with somebody, counseled someone that did that said they regretted it. It was all a positive step. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Well, Dr. Kim, this has been a really encouraging and helpful conversation for us today. Do you have one final piece of advice for our listeners?
Think what I would say out of this, take time to just pray today. Or the next day or so, and just ask God, is there something there that needs to change? Am I angry? Am I bitter? Is there something that you would reveal, and see what God does? And some of you are listening and thinking, I know it. Okay, well, take that first step. Maybe that first step is talking to your spouse about it, asking your spouse to pray with you, coming up with a plan together. Just don't stay stuck. I guess would be the main thing, because it is not going to just go away.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good place to end. So we'll end this week like we do with our anonymous question of the week from one of our listeners. And it's really a fun one. So this is just an easy one for you, Dr. Kim. What is one of the best dates you and Nancy have had lately?
We try to make everything a date, but in May we were asked to go to Vancouver to do a wedding. My best friend that I've grown up with, his best friend in our marriage, and his daughter was getting married, and they asked me to do that. And then we had a free afternoon while we were up there. So Nancy and I got bikes, and they have this huge park that takes a couple hours to bike around called Stanley Park. And so we did that, and you're right there on the water, and some of the boats there are gorgeous, just beautiful landscape. And there's an aquarium there, and we stopped for a while and went to the aquarium, and it was just being out, and we love being out in nature. It was a place we'd never been before. It was kind of a challenging ride and a fun ride. But that was just a great afternoon date, and that we did, because we were pretty structured the time we were there, but we took advantage of that just to go off, the two of us. And it's experience, it's one of the experiences you just talk about. Remember that day we took that bike ride? Remember when this happened? Nancy did fall over once. And these two guys that were built like I would like to be built were right there to help her up, and I was over there, and she said, "No, they're helping me." but she was okay. But
okay, good. I laughed, and then I felt like, oh no, I was assuming she was fine.
She fell in the bush. It was, I think, had a couple of stickers, but that was about it.
Maybe she saw the guys, and she's like, "I'm going to need some help."
But they were great, and so I mean, but those kind of things are things you remember and have fun. So it was really a memorable date that we'll remember. It was fun.
That sounds awesome. That sounds really fun. I love that. Good. Well, thanks for sharing that good date idea. Hopefully, some of us can go have some fun with a spouse. That'd be great.
Absolutely,
great way to end this conversation, processing stuff. So if you are subscribed to Dr. Kim's One Thing Each Day email, then you have the option to submit an anonymous question as well. There's a link right in the email for that. If you're not signed up, make sure you sign up for that today. The link is always in our show notes for Dr. Kim's One Thing. And to end this episode, to circle back where we started, talking about my granddad, who was the inspiration for this, his wife, Ernie, was on an episode of the Awesome Marriage podcast several months back. And her story is just so encouraging, and it's a great example of somebody who also did not get bitter, but got better. And I loved listening to that. And I think you'll enjoy that too. So make sure to listen to that if you haven't. We'll link that in the show notes too. Remember, you can always find us on Facebook, on Instagram, and Dr. Kim is on TikTok. And of course, we can always get emails from you at info@awesomemarriage.com if there's anything we can do to help you. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great day and do something awesome for your marriage today.